Okay, we're going to begin the whole course with a study in Plato's Republic, not looking at the whole book, unfortunately, because it's well worth reading. It is a masterpiece in education theory, as well as for the field of politics and idea of even human psychology. It's a study in that. It's actually, and this is one of the things that is often overlooked in the study of education theory and even of politics, is that the reason Plato writes this is because he wants to deal with the topic of justice. Let me backtrack a little bit. Plato himself, who is he, and so forth. Without going into too much detail, because I want to get to the material, Plato is a young man who grew up in the midst of against the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War, and spent time in military service himself, as all Athenian citizens did. So I should say a little bit about the nature of political life in Athens. Citizens were only males, and only those who had sufficient property to exercise their duties without the compulsion to work for a living. So they're wealthy enough to busy themselves about the work of the polis, which is the Greek word for the city-state of the day, the polis, P-O-L-I-S, from which we get our word politics. The translation, by the way, of republic is a Latin translation, first rendered, I think, by Cicero, of the Greek word polis, and in Latin it's the res publica, the thing of the public. The res is a Latin word for the thing, or the topic of the public. And by the public, he's talking about the public sphere. And the public sphere is the sphere in which the politicians busy themselves. They spend their lives dealing with public matters, public policy, what ought the city to be doing. And that is sharply distinguished from the private sphere. And the private sphere is what people who busy themselves with when they are forced to make a living. They don't have a means to sustain their life, so they have to be busy about making sure that they can put food on the table. So the citizens of Athens or any of these Greek polises are going to be well off, sufficiently well off to concern themselves with the public good and not with private good. Private benefit excludes them. So they're not to be seeking wealth by seeking office. There's an awareness to some degree of corruption, but also of the purpose, the collective purpose of all freeborn citizens of wanting to pursue justice and goodness, things that are collectively recognized as such. So the public good, it will benefit everyone, but in particular, it will benefit freeborn men and allow them to pursue matters like justice and not be sidetracked by, again, selfish motivations. So they're not paid for the office. That would have been an anathema for them to even consider that being paid. They would have had to have been sufficiently wealthy for that. So Plato is concerning himself with the topic of justice. When he does that, he's considering it in the context of a Greek city-state. And the idea that the polis is there to pursue certain aims that are worthy of freeborn men. And one of those is justice. They want to pursue justice. And one of his interlocutors, right at the beginning, Thrasymachus, comes up with the definition of justice, which is basically something like justice is the best people getting what they want, or might makes right. So justice is what the rich and the powerful, what we call the rich and the powerful getting what they want in the courts of law. That's what justice is. A very cynical take on justice, one that you will hear very commonly in our day. And you may experience commonly in our day as well. So do the rich and the powerful have better lawyers? Do they tend to get the law to decide in their favor? At any rate, Thrasymachus says that's what justice is. And really, he might be making a comment on how corrupt the system is. Plato is not satisfied with that, or at least Socrates, who is his spokesman, is not satisfied with that definition of justice. And he says, no, that's not what justice is. That might be the result of corrupted judicial processes, but that is not what justice is. And so thus begins the justification or the exploration of justice in the Republic. So the Republic, although it is about the polis, the ideal city-state, and will deal with the relations of various people within that body, is actually really focused on that one topic. And it comes out to be about education theory, in part because he wants to say, well, who's the best placed people, not in terms of their station, but rather in terms of their virtues, really, of educating the next generation. So that's why it becomes education theory. But what's also interesting is that very early on in this discussion of justice between Thrasymachus and Socrates, and others get dragged in there as well, is the observation made by Socrates that justice is a very difficult thing to discuss on an individual basis, because he wants to start off by the individual. What is justice? And so one of the things about this, which is often overlooked, is that when he's talking about it on a political level, at the macro level, if you will, he is really concerned with which faculty within the individual ought to be ruling. And there are three in the Greeks' estimation here, by the way, that they will acknowledge. On the one hand, they will have the reason. On the other hand, they will have the will. And then finally, they will have the appetites or the passions. Later get called the passions. But there's part of us that when we deliberate and consider justice, that is involved, that we will associate with reasoning. There's part that will be with choice. And then there is a third, which is motivated by the appetites. Now, the appetites tend to be associated with the body. As you would think, an appetite, I get hungry, my body needs to be fed. But we could also, and these are ranked in an order of, or a hierarchy here of excellence, at least by Plato's estimation. So, and you can see how it lines up with the Greek notion, broad Greek notions of how the city-state considers those to be citizens and non-citizens. The citizens can be ruled by reason and not be subject to their appetites because they've been freed from the necessity of having to look after their bodily needs. They have slaves that do that. They have fields of their own. The slaves work in them. They produce food. They eat the food. They have people who cook for them, etc. Those are taken care of. So their appetites are already dealt with. So now they can work on the basis of reason and so forth. So there's strictly or roughly speaking a clear delineation between the faculties within the individual human person and the organization of the polis. So again, the appetites and passions will be represented by people that look after bodily needs. The laborers of any sort. And this is the reason that women are excluded from the being politicians, by the way, because they are subject to the processes of labor. They give birth. they're tied in the circle of life more. They can't escape it. I'm not saying whether I agree with it or not, but I'm merely noting that women are excluded from this. And it's not because they lack reasoning at all, although some of the Greek philosophers suggest that that is the case, that they're more, but they're making a very sweeping, broad statement more on their understanding of how free, because the ideal is that they will be totally free from such concerns. That will not be their consideration. They're not going to go here motivated by their passions alone. And within the Greek city-state in Plato's day, there is a battle between the aristocrats, who are motivated more by the excellent, and then the mob. The more commonly, even though they have citizens' rights, still they seem to be motivated more by greed. Let's go there to get treasure. That's part of the deliberations. They have every right to do this, but this is the wrong motivation. We ought not to go to war for the sake of just becoming richer. We ought to do it because it's right. There's an injustice that needs to be remedied, etc. So there's political debates here. But you can see that within what he's going to place as individual groups within the city-state, these correspond to the states of the human soul, if you will. And the reason ought to be ruling over all of these in Plato's estimation. And so he'll talk about this, I think, in book 4 of the Republic. I might be wrong about it. It might be book 3, but he's going to talk about the different parts of the individual soul. But he says this is very difficult to illustrate on the microcosmic level. Let me go to the macrocosmic level and let's talk about what a city is like. There are different groups within that city, and hence the Republic. But really it is, you could say it's as a treatise as much about the soul as it is about, on an individual level, as it is about, as I say, politics or social interaction. And so this is why in education theory the question is, which Plato is engaged with here, it's not so much, although it's partly, who should be running education as which part of us should be involved in the education process. And the debate that's going to arise is going to be against the backdrop of Greek civic life. Because in Greek civic life, the teachers of Greece are the poets. Chiefly Homer and the epic poets. And there are those individuals called rhapsodes who perform in public squares Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and so forth in a public setting. So people are sitting around listening. In our day we will read from scripture and then there'll be a sermon. There's no sermon here. They will just go to the original text and they will perform it. And those that are sitting around are not only hearing it, and this is a story, but then they're reflecting and meditating on what's going on in the Odyssey. Why is Odysseus trapped on the island with Calypso in book 5? What's going on there? Okay, there's a man, he's shipwrecked, and there's a woman, she's a nymph. What is he fighting against there? The way they will explain it is that Odysseus is fighting against his passions. He needs to hold on to his reason. He needs to do the right thing. He needs to keep his eyes fixed on the need to return home and to preserve his family and to fight against his passions. Well, why would his passions be, or his appetites be motivated here? Well, because Calypso is a beautiful nymph and she offers him immortality. His body will never waste away. He will have eternal life. Immortality, this is what the Greek city-state is dedicated towards, in fact, immortality of the body. Yes, but how about of the mind, the soul? Is he really interested in what's good and true and beautiful and just? That's how they're going to explain that encounter in book 5 of the Odyssey. It's not just abstract. They think there's something inherently philosophical about what Homer's depicting there. Did you have a question? Yes.
Yeah. I understand the argument that the aristocracy, since they perhaps have more of their appetites or passions fulfilled, the idea that that would lead them to be
Every citizen has them, even those that aren't. So this is the additional complexity. Within those that are citizens, there are some who are considered to be aristocrats. Aristos in Greek means the best, and krat is the rule. So the aristocracy is the rule of the best. Don't think of it in terms of just a noble birthright. There's a bit of that, but it's more those who are inclined towards that. So there are some who are in the position of being citizens that seem to be motivated by the wrong things, and this is partly what Plato is arguing about, because he's on the side of the aristocrats against some of his fellow citizens who, yes, they have the right to vote, but they don't actually vote in accordance with the best things. So it's part of what he's debating there. I interrupted you. Were you?
No.
That makes sense?
No, that makes sense.
Yeah, because don't think of it like the French or even modern politics, where the commoners have a say in governance. That's not the case in Athens. The commoners are not there. There is no third estate where the people get their representatives. There are no people's representatives here. They're all wealthy enough to be divorced from care about money. But even amongst those, there are distinctions of those who are motivated by different things. And that's what he's really addressing there. Okay?
Yeah, and I understand the idea that in that higher class, they would, since they have a more comfortable lifestyle, certain passions to fulfill them wouldn't be as important for them. But at the same time, I'm also interested in, wouldn't that make them even more so governed by the passions because they're constantly being fulfilled for them? And is it possible for the commoner to also have his passions in control by his reason in the same way, because there's less of an opportunity for him to fulfill those passions in the first place. So I find like
I think you're confusing the issues here a little bit.
Yeah.
And this is more of a secondary discussion that will arise out of this. How does this apply to us today? And are the commoners, if as you were, or those who are laborers, are they actually capable of reasoning? And the answer is surely yes. But they're required by their circumstances to work. If you don't work, you're not going to eat. So in that sense, they are tied to their appetites, whether they're good or bad. One of the things that's interesting in Homer is the most noble character that he displays is a swineherd, a pig farmer. And he is laboring. And yet his motivations for action are noble. And he's praised for this. And that's interesting as well. Again, so in the line of from a philosophical way of looking at things, Homer regularly commends us to consider the best things and the just things. Remember, the swineherd is loyal to Odysseus, even though Odysseus has been gone 20 years. And he looks after his son, even acts like something of a mentor, even though he's only a slave. And we find out that he himself had been a prince, but he'd been enslaved. And yet he was loyal to his master, even in his absence and so forth. And he's praised to the heavens by Homer. Homer says, my swineherd, even directly addresses him. He's so pleased with this, commending him to the audience watching this. So even to your point then, even those who are low-born and are not capable of being divorced from looking after their bodily needs can nonetheless pursue justice and reason, and they're commended and encouraged to do by Homer. And so it's not just that, if you have to look after your putting bread on the table, that you're incapable of good or just action. He's not saying that at all. But the purpose of the city-state is to ensure this. And the irony is that when Plato is writing this, he finds that people who have been freed from that, nonetheless pursue things for selfish gain. Nonetheless, just like in our day. So many people who are born wealthy squander their time and resources on selfish pleasures. It's ignoble for them to do so, but they do so. That's not what the city-state was made to be. And if there are enough of them, then the city is going to degenerate and become corrupt, and ultimately it's going to get taken over by foreign powers. And so there's a necessity within the city-state for those who are freed from the bodily appetites to be consistent with that and recognize they have to be just in their pursuits and so forth. So Thrasymachus' observation that, you know what, might makes right is what justice is. He's making an observation that people who are divorced from these things aren't actually aristocratic at all. They're selfish. They seek their own gain and not the good. But Plato comes back to him and says that's not what justice is. And there is actually a thing called justice. Because you dispute that there is on the basis of the fact that people who are so-called the elite don't act in accordance with that. But that doesn't deny that it is there. And then he goes about to try and demonstrate that there is justice. And that everyone acknowledges that there is such a thing. And believe that everyone else ought to be doing just things as well, which is when C.S. Lewis picks this up in Mere Christianity, why children in the playground say to other children, that's not fair. They say that's not fair because the two of them recognize that there's a code of conduct which is just, and the one has not done the just thing, and the other is saying to them, you know that's wrong. You know that's wrong. How do they know that's wrong? Because it's something that he says every person knows. It's part of the human frame. It's a moral awareness within the human frame that every person, and we expect everyone to recognize that. And Lewis is going to call that the Tao. That's another text, another topic, but it's talking about that very thing. And Plato is very interested in that moral awareness as well. So it's not just reason, but it's a moral reasoning. That's the main thing. It's not abstract mathematical reasoning only. There's a moral aspect to it. It's very important.
I suppose my question would be just exactly at that point, like since reason is moral and it applies to all, maybe this is a bit of a different issue.
I think it ends up getting there.
Yeah.
So for today, this is my challenge on the course, but we can do this, and we're going to end up doing this on the course anyway. Mm-hmm. I want to present what the original text is saying. And I want to do it without the complications of our ways of looking at it, because even concepts like reason have been transformed over the course of time, and they have certain connotations that aren't necessarily there in the beginning, and I would like to sort of clean them up a bit. So here's what Plato is saying, and here's the context, and then we can say, okay, but what comes of this term afterwards, and how does it develop over the course of time? Because it will. And particularly in the light of Christianity, certain types of conduct are going to undergo a radical transformation. But I want to look at them before the transformation, let alone contemporary views of this. So again, the contemporary view of Plato's notion of justice would be immediately to say that this identity group of the slaves or the women or children or anyone that's not, this is unjust. It's socially unjust. And we'll talk about that immediately and get sidetracked by that and think, okay, we can discuss this, but let's try and understand what Plato is saying first, and then we may find that there's more to what he's saying than simply the issue of groups being excluded from voting that are somehow receiving injustice in the process.
In Plato's
He would have said that it is the case, by the way. If you're a slave, he wouldn't say it's unjust. He would say that's your lot in life. It's a misfortune of birth to be born in that station, and you don't want to be a slave. And he wouldn't have said that their nature's a slave, because again, the way you become a slave there, we mustn't confuse it with slavery in the modern world. You become a slave by being captured by a foreign power, You can be a prince like the swineherd, Eumaeus. He was born a nobleman, but because he was captured in battle, he lost his freedom and was forced to serve another man. And so he couldn't pursue the good and be seen to be doing that. But he did it privately when no one saw it. And that's why he's so praised. Because these men in politics exist to be seen by their fellow aristocrats so that their name can be passed on in perpetuity. Everyone will talk about the great Pericles and the great Athenian politicians. Everyone will talk about them. Who's going to talk about Eumaeus the swineherd? No one. But Homer praises him because although nobody saw him and he was in the private sphere, literally he did the just thing. That is the most praiseworthy of all. Very Christian in some ways.
So would Plato acknowledge that Eumaeus chose reason, which is a moral good, and over the passion
yes,
in his position as a swineherd?
Yes, he did. I think he did. Because it's not just that he tells the story, the poet comes so far into the tale as to show himself to the audience. He says, "Oh, Eumaeus, my swineherd." Like it's an interjection into the text. You don't even think Homer's there. And then suddenly, for the first time, he can't stop himself. This is so praiseworthy that somebody who has been made into a slave, and the worst of all of them, he's a pig farmer, his master's not even there, and he still always does what's right. So he's not like, you expect an aristocrat to behave that way, and you know what he displays? They don't behave that way. The aristocrats he shows in the Odyssey are behaving abominably. The suitors, these are aristocrats. What are they doing? They're drinking, they're carousing, they're trying to marry Penelope, they're sleeping with the servant girls. Yeah, but those are the aristocrats. And yet the worst, the lowest born, he acts the way they should act. So again, Homer is in agreement with Plato on this, right? They're coming at it from a very different angle, but they're illustrating the exact same thing.
Okay, I just didn't understand that one point.
Right, okay, well, then that's a good reason to ask, right? And so what's interesting about that, given what I just said, is Plato's eventual stance within the Republic, which is that, and we'll come to this in Book 10 at the end, is that the poets ought not to be teaching the polis because they don't know what the good is. It's the philosophers that know it, not the poets. And you think, hold on, does Homer not know what the good is? I just demonstrated that he does. He shows us Eumaeus. He commends Eumaeus to us. He demonstrates a man like Odysseus who's motivated by the good. He will throw his passions and desires, his own selfish needs, even that of immortality, which is what the city states. Therefore, he has it. Why wouldn't he just stick with that? Because he doesn't think that it's right. And he's going to resist his passions. He's going to demonstrate reason. Okay, so does Homer not teach the same as Plato then in the end? I think he does. But that's not what we will find in Plato's Republic. He's going to commend, I think, to the same end in some ways, but he's going to starkly demonstrate the distinction between the philosophic life and that of the poet. Does that make sense? I think the context really helps clarify things for us. But this is Athens, and here's the Acropolis up there, the high point where we, what do we have up there? We have the Supreme Court. It's Mars Hill, the Areopagus, right? This is where the High Court of Athens meet to adjudicate and to do what then? To determine justice, right? And note that it's at the peak of the state of Athens. It says something about its commitment to justice then. And so when Paul goes to speak on Mars Hill, Areopagus, and disputes with who's there, the philosophers are hanging around there because they're used to talking about matters of justice. It's not just they're hanging about there. This is an association there. They are really concerned with the issue of justice. And what Paul does in that, I'm getting off topic here a bit, is he's really bringing the question, what is real justice? Well, it's when you acknowledge the justice of proper theology. There's a God that you have to rightly observe before you can even do justice. So that's bringing a whole different dimension into it. We will get to that in time, but not even the geography and everything pushes us in, and the context helps elucidate what Paul is doing when he goes to that particular place. He probably went other places in Athens as well, but that's where we're given the account by Luke that he goes to Athens and disputes on Mars Hill. The Supreme Court of Athens, arguing about the gods. And he sees all sorts of gods up there being worshipped. But there is a God they don't know. And he's the God who made heavens and earth. He is the one who is connected with justice. Because the squabbling gods that Plato is also going to take issue, and this is one of the issues, by the way, that he takes Homer to task over, is he portrays the gods as being unjust. They squabble, they lie, they cheat, they steal. They're unfaithful in their relationships. They seem motivated by their passions. How can we call these figures gods? They're like the worst of men. So it's an attack. Plato is making the same attack on the gods that Paul is in some ways. It's not exactly the same because Socrates and Plato don't know the one true God who made heaven and earth, but he's appealing to this. And for this reason, Plato's move to uphold justice, goodness, beauty, and see them in some sense interconnected. Some have speculated in the early church that Plato must have been acquainted with the scriptures. And how would that have been? Because it's not in the Greek conception that he would have got that awareness. They're polytheists. The speculation is that it was during a time he was down in Egypt, on a trip down there, and he was probably exposed. Remember, Hebrews would have been in Egypt. They would have left Egypt, but they would have gone back to Egypt. Some of them would have been there, and he would have been exposed to the teaching of Moses, and it would have had its effect on him. I'm not saying that there's absolute confirmation of this, but I can't remember which church father said this either, but I know that I've read it, that there's some belief that Plato was influenced by scriptural awareness with his own conception of this, and it was transformative of the Greek mind then. But it's already there in Homer to some degree. He's already lauding a moral goodness that is there even in the lowest born. He's already there. But Plato makes it more clear that that is what we ought to be teaching and understanding from Homer. Unambiguous. And who is committed to that unambiguous pursuit of the truth and of the good and of the just? It is the philosophers. That's their whole life is dedicated to that. And in fact, this will be Aristotle, not Plato, but Aristotle will go so far as to say that there are only two legitimate forms of life. And when I say two legitimate, there are two that are options for the freeborn. You can either pursue the political life, politikos, or you can pursue the philosophical life. You can either be a politician, or you can dedicate yourself to the life of the mind, the life of reason. These are the two forms of life, 1, 2, that Aristotle acknowledges. He says they both have their place. And really they're pursuing the same ends, rightly seen. But this form of life, the theoretical life, the life of the philosopher, the life of the mind, does not exist before Socrates. It gets its endorsement and its praise because of Socrates and the way Plato represents him and other writers for that matter. And then Aristotle follows down the same path. So it's when he identifies these. They both would have said up to this point that politicians ought to pursue reason. That's what Plato is saying. So they ought to pursue the life of the mind even while they're pursuing the life of action. They ought to, but they don't. So what we need to do is create a whole cast of individuals who are dedicated to the intellectual pursuit of the good, the true, the beautiful, and the just. He's going to call those the philosophers. What do the philosophers love? They love wisdom. Sophia's wisdom. They pursue wisdom. But this whole grouping does not exist before Plato. And then suddenly it does. And the foremost example of this is the figure of Socrates, a man who was also freeborn and served in the Athenian army, but rather than spending his time in political office, he went around debating the nature of the things that were at stake amongst his fellow citizens. Is that really good? Is that really just? And he would go ask people who were famed for these things what they thought this was, and then he would give them a lesson and demonstrate that he knew more than they did. But pursuing the life of the mind in conjunction with the famous Delphic oracle, know yourself, the great injunction in Greek here. This was what the Delphic oracle said to Socrates when he went to consult it. Know thyself. And himself, is he mostly his appetites? Is he in his will? Or is he above all connected with his moral reasoning? And he will say, yes, it's the moral reasoning. So there's a strong push in the works of Plato and in the intellectual tradition of the West after this to pursue the life of philosophy. You have to be divorced from cares. You have to live in an ivory tower, more or less. You have to be, you can't be busied by having to look after your family financially. That has to be taken care of, because you have to focus only on this and not be committed to other motivations. You have to love the good. You have to love the just, and you have to seek that it is brought about. And so Plato proposes a whole class of people whom he calls guardians, who will do exactly this. Now, I say this at the beginning. I'm going to get to Plato just in 2 seconds, but the life of the mind, the philosophical life, the ideal life that Plato presents to us here were so persuasive and powerful that they changed the Greek's notion of itself, and it was passed on to the Romans. The Romans held on to this as well. There's an ideal that's represented in the Republic. Note in the Star Wars makes a big deal out of this. There's a time when the Republic is there for the good of all. It's the public good, the res publica. We pursue the public good, and the nobility is there to pursue noble ends, not to make themselves richer and fatter and whatever. It's to pursue the good at all times. They get involved then in power politics, because to pursue the good, they have to have enough power to fight off those who want bad ends there. So they have to. So this is the complex aspect of being in politics. If you're really just a man who has enough money not to worry about your financial concerns, but somebody is in the same position but has 1,000,000 times your wealth, they can pay other people off to fight you and keep you from doing the good. So this is the complexity of it in a practical sense, is that there are people in that position of being divorced from having to look after themselves who nonetheless are of bad character and selfish character, and those who want to preserve the good are. And so this is why it's often called an idyllic or a utopian view, Plato's, are we really ever in the position where the people in leadership are only doing the good things and that they're not interested in power? And I think the answer is no, they're not. They always are forced to, because their opponents are only interested in power. And so those who want to do good say, I've got to give a little bit of, concession to, I have to give some perks to my followers here, because otherwise I'm going to lose position here and I won't be able to do any good, and they get compromised in the process as a result, right? Corrupted by power, portrayed regularly in our dramas. But Plato's ideal here is so potent and beautiful that I think it reigns over the Western education for 2,500 years. I shouldn't say 2,500 years. There are breaks in it, and the breaks in it come in the last century. I'm going to read an extract here from the most significant modern educator, whose name is John Dewey. Dewey's a very interesting man. You'll read about him if you ever do Bachelor's of Education. They'll talk about Dewey and his theories and so forth. Associated with modern public education, though, he's probably the most significant figure there. He delivers a lecture at Columbia University, and the lecture is entitled "The Influence of Darwin on Philosophy." I'll just read a short extract here. But he says that Darwin's Origin of Species invokes an intellectual revolt and introduced a new intellectual temper. What is that? Here's, I quote, "The conceptions that had reigned in the philosophy of nature and knowledge for 2,000 years, the conceptions that had become the familiar furniture of the mind, rested on the assumption of the superiority of the fixed and final. The fixed and the final, the good, the true, the beautiful, the just. These were clear, fixed, final things. And the intellectual life, the life of education, ought to be calibrated in accordance with these fixed and final things. Good today is the same as it was yesterday. Good of your grandparents is the same as good today. It doesn't change from generation. It's not subject to the vicissitudes of place and time. It's not subject to whether you're a male or a female, young or old, black or white, none of those things. It's fixed and final. He says under Origin of Species, he says a mode of thinking is introduced that in the end was bound to transform the logic of knowledge, and hence the treatment of morals, politics, and religion, and making them not fixed and final then. That's 1909. And this is Dewey commenting on the influence of Darwinist thought. Darwinists also have a view of human nature. I'm not going to get sidetracked and bogged down into a critique of Darwinism here, but I do think that there is something in Dewey's observation. And Dewey approves of what Darwin does here. Rather than justice being fixed and final, it is something that is subject to change. And in Dewey's conception, improvement. We can do better. This is a totally different mindset than Plato had. You can't do better than what's good or the best. If something's already just, you can't improve on just. If you do something that's just, you've done the best thing you can possibly do. You can't do better. It's either just or, so if there's something that falls short of it, well, then you haven't done the just thing. Okay, fair enough. But if it's just, you don't get better than that. The problem is you don't meet that ideal. This is Plato's critique. This is also Homer's critique. You know what the just thing is, and you don't do it. Just do it, and then we're good. This conception is that the things that were fixed and final, the good, the true, the beautiful, the just, are not fixed and final, but provisional and liable to improvement. It's a totally different mindset. Dewey claims old ideas give way slowly, and, quote, intellectual progress usually occurs through sheer abandonment of questions. We do not solve them, we get over them. So on this course, I'm not going to abandon the questions. I'm going to restate the questions. Remember, this is the history of literary theory. Next semester we'll deal with contemporary stuff, where they do get rid of the questions. They don't even ask the questions anymore. My purpose on this course is to raise questions that contemporary critics don't consider. Like in contemporary lit theory, they'll have colonialist, post-colonialist literary theories. They'll have queer theories, they'll have feminist theories, all of which will involve notions of justice. But they won't ask the question, what is justice? Which is a problem. If you're going to pursue theories that are predicated on an injustice, you have to define what justice is first. So you got to ask that question. And once you've asked that question and looked at the various aspects of it, and they're not straightforward, they're pretty complicated, then you can come to the issues and argue whether the theories are good theories or whether they're a little bit inadequate in certain ways, which is a polite way for me of saying that they're actually often fraudulent even. Not always, but they're not thinking deeply or broadly enough. And so the intellectual revolt of Darwin and Dewey against the idea of fixed and firm questions, I think the only way we can address this is not by screaming against their theories, but by presenting good theories that stood the test of time, and then we'll find out whether they help us engage with our contemporaries who don't consider these things. I happen to think that they will. Because the truth is powerful. That's why I became an academic. I decided I was going to go down the path because I'm so persuaded by this argument that I think if I pursue this with zeal, there will be a reward for it. And I can tell you the writers that we're going to be reading this semester, for the most part, are of the same mind. They will believe that Plato was right, and the rest of the Western intellectual tradition, as someone once said, are footnotes to Plato. Oh yes, Plato said it this way, and Aristotle, we'll look at him next class. Aristotle is largely in agreement with Plato. And in fact, he's just going to expand on it. Yes, that's this life that he says is associated with reason is what Aristotle calls this life, and a life unknown before, but now the most worthy of all, according to Aristotle. That's why he chooses it and doesn't become a politician. But is it practical? Yes, it is, because Aristotle will become the teacher of Alexander the Great, the greatest politician in Greek history, who slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. That's interesting as well. Right? He didn't follow Plato's advice. He slept with it because he saw a man there of greatness and he wanted to be like him, but he had a notion of greatness and justice. It wasn't just selfish motivation. He wanted to bring the greatness of Greece and its conception of the good, the true, the beautiful around the world. He did it through the sword. Is he successful in doing what he aimed to do? I don't know, but still. The whole Greco-Roman world is well, there is no Roman. The whole world of that day is transformed by Alexander. He brings a library to Alexandria, the city that he founds, and it's the great library of the ancient world where knowledge is promoted. So it's not just he wanted to conquer it so that these little colonies would give tribute back to Greece, and so that he would get richer. He wanted knowledge to be disseminated everywhere. Now, as in, Alexander did not know God, but he did love the truth. In certain ways. So Dewey and Darwin abandoned the claim to know what is permanently good and true and beautiful. And my own personal belief is that this abandonment is absolutely fatal and we need to get over it. And we're going to try and do that in this class. Back to Plato's Republic. I did want to talk about this. This is in book 6. or there are different types of knowing that comes from the various faculties. There are the immaterial powers of knowing, faculties he calls the intelligence and reason. And then there are the material powers of knowing, which are opinion and sense. I have to present this to you because it's essential to his argument in Book 7 when he comes to the allegory of the cave. There are different ways of knowing things. You can know them with the eyes of the mind, or you can do it with the physical eyes. The physical eyes are obviously connected with the passions and so forth, the lust of the eye. She's beautiful. She's beautiful, yes, but where do you get the idea of beauty from? That's the true beauty, not her, but the thing that she represents. That's what the intelligence and reason represents. These are immaterial powers of knowing. And this is what the philosopher pursues, is the immaterial powers of knowing. Whereas the poet does deal with powers of knowing. And so therefore, as I said, Homer can commend Eumaeus the swineherd. And we love him because he loves justice, and he's a good man. And Plato, or rather Homer, does understand this, and he conveys it to us. And he does it through wonderful stories. So we remember the story of Eumaeus the swineherd. However, because it's on the basis of the material and it's closer to the appetites and passions, it's not quite good enough for Plato. And they all often go, Homer will also make mistakes. And he chiefly makes the mistakes on the most important things of all, namely the nature of the gods. He gets them totally wrong. Exact same thing that Paul is alleging on Mars Hill. It's coming from a different angle, but saying you don't know anything about God. You can't. Because your gods are immoral, terrible. And Socrates says this is, and he was killed for this, by the way, because he was accused of perverting the youth of Athens by denying. Why? Because he was denying their gods. It was a theological charge. You're perverting the youth of Athens. You're making them doubt the gods and Homer and all of this. How dare you? Forced to drink hemlock, poison. He actually had a choice. Either drink the poison or go into exile, leave the city altogether. And he said, I will not leave the city. The city represents the good, and I'm a part of the city. I won't do that. He drank the poison. Plato watched it and wrote it down. It's in his apology. We're not reading that here. But his apology is his explanation for why he lived the life that he did. He didn't pursue the life of the politician. He pursued this life. This is why I did, because I love the good. And when you say that I deny the gods, I reject your accusation. I revere the gods. The ones that you call the gods are based on what Homer says the gods are like, and they cannot possibly be like that because they're not just. But the gods are just. So I don't deny that there are many gods. I deny that they can possibly be the way Homer does. He's just speculating, and he's giving them all sorts of human characteristics, but they're too human. They're too corrupt. The gods cannot be like that. They're better than Homer says. So I don't deny that they exist. I do deny that Homer's depiction of them can be right. Because no one called gods can be so bad as these big babies. Right? They're pouting, they're fighting, they're squabbling, they demand to be treated like a spoiled child. They're just immortal, so you can't kill them. But if you had a child that was like this, you would think this was a really bad person and they needed a spanking. Time out and correction, because their character is terrible. That's Plato's. But he's not really talking about, he's not directly going after the gods here. He's going over the appetites and the passions that lead Homer to that conception of the gods. He's misled, and so he is too inclined towards the material powers of knowing and not sufficiently attuned to the immaterial powers of knowing. And that's what he says a better city-state will be orientated towards. So then he presents the allegory of the cave to illustrate this in Book 7. But you need to see the divided line here and say the difference between immaterial powers of knowing and material powers of knowing. The poet uses material powers of knowing. He appeals to physical beings to illustrate abstract conceptions. What's with the allegory of the cave? Well, I hope you read it, but roughly speaking, it is just this. It's called the allegory of the cave. Let me show in a figure, there's another way of putting it, how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Now note the irony here. Plato, critiquing the poets, uses a poetic device, a story, to illustrate his position. He does this regularly. So I don't take seriously, I'm just saying this now because if I leave it to the end of the class, I'll run out of time. I don't take seriously his critique of poetry in general, but rather of Homer and his conception of the gods. I think Plato regularly appeals to stories to illustrate his points, and he's not averse to using beautiful language and story to make it very clear his allegiance to the philosophical life. So you can have a philosophical type of poetry without corrupt gods in it and so forth. And later writers will, poets in particular, love Plato. They just think that he speaks to them because he loves the good, the just, the true, the beautiful, and so do they. And so they're offended by the fact that in his ideal republic, he's going to throw them out entirely. That's in book 10. They have to go. But this is why. Because they deal with this. And therefore, they're too subject to the passions and appetites. They're at a third remove from reality. So back to the allegory of the cave. Behold, now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings live in an underground den, so in a cave, which has a mouth open towards the light and reaching all along the den. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move. So you can imagine them fixed in a cave, and they are forced to face it, and they can't even turn their heads because their necks are chained. And can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning around their heads. Above and behind them a fire is blazing in a distance, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised way. And you will see, if you look, a low wall built along the way, like at the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. I see. He doesn't see anything. He's not illustrating. Imagine this. And what they will see on the wall of the cave, because there's a light behind it, is a shadow play on the wall. And they've never seen anything else. They will see figures and they will hear voices, but this is what they see. And do you see men passing along the wall carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals made of wood and stone and various materials which appear over the wall? Some of them are talking, others silent. Note that they're not just shadow play. It's not like mime. There's voices being associated with this. So they hear a story and they see the pictures on the wall, cast by the light of fire behind them. And as I say, you've shown me a strange image, and they are strange prisoners, like ourselves, I replied, and they see only their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. True, he said, how could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? And of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they could only see the shadows? Yes, he said, and if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them with one another? Would they agree that's the good guy, that's the bad guy, would they not agree amongst themselves? Because they're all looking at the same thing. Of course they would. Yes, that's just. Oh, that's unjust. Very true. And suppose further that the prison had an echo which came from the other side, would they not be sure to fancy, when one of the passers-by spoke, that the voice which they heard came from the passing shadow? So they actually think the shadows are speaking, because there's an echo and it reverberates around. They have no idea where the voices come from. It's the shadow that's spoken. No question, he replied. To them, I said, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. That is certain. And now look again. and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of the error. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck around and walk and look towards the light, so somebody comes along, unlocks the chains, and picks them up and turns them around, forces them to look in the other direction. What will they see? The glare will distress him. He'll be in pain. And he will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows. You can imagine this if you're ever in a dark basement and you run out into the sunlight, you're blinded at first. You literally can't see. You're falling down. The light blinds you. He will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows, and then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion, but that now, when he's approaching nearer to being and his eye is turned towards some real existence, he has a clearer vision. What will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects as they pass and requiring him to name them. Will he not be perplexed? Because suddenly he sees there's a man physically beside him. He can see the man. He can point to the object and he sees it, but they're not shadows anymore. He won't know what they are. Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? Of course, because he identified those with reality before. Now he sees an object in front of him. It'll be like a shadow. That's not the reality. He'll deny it at first. Far truer. And if he is compelled to look straight at the light, will he not have a pain in his eyes which will make him turn away to take refuge to the objects of vision which he can see, and which he will conceive to be in reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to them? So he'll prefer the shadows. Even when he's shown the reality, he's going to say, that's nonsense. The shadows, that's the thing. Let me go back and look at the shadows. And suppose once more that he is reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he's forced into the presence of the sun itself. By the way, if you read the Purgatory by Dante, going up Mount Purgatory is a bit like this. He has to be sort of forced up because he doesn't want, there's a resistance to the good as he goes up and up towards he can't look at the light. He's blinded by it. This is a way of understanding. Later writers, Plato doesn't call it understanding sin. The motivation not to want to acknowledge the truth. You're actually motivated to deny it. Because the shadow in front of you was something you controlled. And whereas this is something that is in control of God. And you will have to acknowledge that you're his creature at that point and give yourself over to a position of humility. But when he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all, what are called realities, and he will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. And first he will see the shadows best. Next, the reflections of men and other objects in the water, and then the objects themselves. Then he will gaze upon the light of the moon and the stars and the spangled heaven, and he will see the sky and the stars by night better than the sun or the light of the sun by day, certainly. So at first he will see better at night. There's some light, but at least it's not so bright. So there's a process of enlightenment that takes place here as he moves from the material powers of knowing in the direction of the immaterial powers of knowing. He's going in this direction. Last of all, he will be able to see the sun. And not mere reflections of him in the water. You can see the sun's reflection in the water, but you'll be able to look at it directly. But he will see him in his own proper place and not in another, and he will contemplate him as he is, certainly. He will then proceed to argue that this is he who gives the season and the years, the sun, and is the guardian of all that is in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things which he and his fellows have been accustomed to behold. Clearly, he said, he would first see the sun and then reason about the sun. So he'll become a sun worshipper. He's not there yet, but you would see why he might come to that conclusion. Everything's revolving around the sun gives light, etc. And when he remembers his old habitation, and the wisdom of the den and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would felicitate himself on the change and pity them? Would he not be pleased that he had been liberated from his delusions? Of course he would. And if they were in the habit of conferring honors among themselves on those who were quickest to observe the passing shadows and to remark which of them went before, so like those who read Homer and comment on who understands Homer the best, like who is the wisest reader of Homer, and then they praise the man who's the best critic or the best performer of Homer, understanding Homer. Is that not what they were like before when they sat? Yes, that was that world. Okay. While his sight was still weak, and before his eyes had become steady, and the time which would be needed to acquire this new habit of sight might be very considerable, would he not be ridiculous? Men would say of him that he went and down he came without his eyes. So they're going to mock him who sees the sunlight now. They're going to attack him and ridicule him. They're saying, you don't know what you're talking about. The wisest men in the world are these men sitting beside me because they see what I see. And you are looking at something completely different. You don't know what you're talking about. If you deny that they see the good and the just and the true and the beautiful, you know nothing. You're a fool. This is how Socrates was spoken of. Men would say of him that he went and came without eyes, and it is better not even to think of ascending. And if anyone tried to loose another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender and they'd put him to death. Note the attitude, the response towards truth and the hatred of it. He doesn't get into what we would call sin, but it does to some degree explain it. The illustration actually shows not just that they go from blindness to being able to see, but they are committed to the blindness. They're hostile to the light. And they've developed a confirmation bias amongst themselves that is strongly against hearing anything that is at odds with this. This is exactly what we will see at Mars Hill. This entire allegory, I said, you may now apprehend, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. The prison house is the world of sight. The light of the fire is the sun. And you will not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upward to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world according to my poor belief. Intellect, journey of the soul. Immaterial. Which at your desire I've expressed. Whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. But whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all. Last of all. And is seen only with an effort. And when seen is also inferred to be the universal author of all things, beautiful and right. Parent of light, and of the Lord of light in this visible world. And the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual. The intellectual. This is the highest form. And that this is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eye fixed. So, even if you want to be a good politician, you have to be informed and taught by the philosopher who's focused on the intellectual good, not just good opinion. What's the best opinion? That's not good enough because you can be deceived on this. You need to love the good. You need to understand it. Now you can see, just based on the little bit that I presented here, why Christianity finds in Plato an ally. It's making a same sort of comment about the way people are deluded by idolatry and delusion. And that's his critique of Homer in Athens, is that although the Athenian poets, or Homer, who's not Athenian, but would be presented in Athens, and also in Sparta and all the city-states of Greece, they all revered Homer. He was the teacher of all of them. He's called the teacher of all Greece. There is no city or nation called Greece, by the way. There are just little city-states like Corinth and Thebes, Sparta, Athens. You could go on. All the cities in the known world. They are the Greeks. What do they have in common? Homer. The city of Athens is the place where the philosophers reside. The life of the mind is upheld. But in Sparta, they're not interested in the life of the mind. They have no place for it, but they do read Homer, so they still get the moral teaching. But in Athens, they revere this life, and that makes Athens the foundation stone of a Western intellectual tradition alongside Scripture. Athens and Jerusalem. And I think there's a commonality there. There's differences as well, for sure. Among other things, this view of human nature is problematic for Christian theology. It will suggest that your body is something that is the corrupting factor, the corrosive factor. It'll push you towards a sort of a believe that the soul is good and the body is evil. Jesus took on a body. We can't have that. There's going to be challenges and problems with this view. But the moral awareness of the good is a strong overlap, for sure. But then it's going to be, well, what is the nature of the good and the just and the true and the beautiful? Well, God is going to have to reveal that. And contrary to expectations, it's going to be found in the person of Jesus, who acts like Eumaeus the swineherd, like a servant. Pursues the good even though he's not seen to be an aristocrat. Even though he's of the line of David, he doesn't act in accordance with that. He comes humbly on a donkey going into the city of Jerusalem, right? He's going to allow himself to be crucified, which is foolishness to the Greeks. To let yourself be killed rather than to conquer the people who are worse than you, why would you do such a thing? Right? You want to be like Achilles. You conquer the bad people. The good guy wins. That's what you do. In the case of Jesus, the bad guy loses, or the good guy loses, and willingly loses his life. So there's serious challenges to this view. But at the same time, you can see the overlap, and why this, I think, is the first text that we need to be reading in literary theory, because it is about a lot more than literary theory. Comments or questions? I think I'm running short on time here. Yes?
For Plato, can the ultimate good be seen fully in its essence and grasped completely? Like, is beholding the ultimate good a static state, or is it, on another view, like a dynamic state?
It seems dynamic, but the fact that there is a fixed view of the good, the true, the beautiful, and the just seems that it's, I mean, once you get it, you get it. It just takes time to get there. But you can arrive at the end of the journey. And I think Socrates illustrates that. He does illustrate all of the things that later Christian writers will call the transcendentals. He's not using that language here, but in Christian theology, they will unite the good, the true, the beautiful, the just in the person of God. That's not going to happen in this era. It's not going to happen under the Romans. It will happen in the medieval period in the university. The university thinks that there's a uniting factor, God, behind all the discrete areas of human knowledge, which we can pursue, but we have to see their unity in God. When universities abandon Christian theology at the center of what they do, they're no longer universities. They have no unifying thing. They don't know what justice is anymore. Or if they do, then it's not even Plato's justice, and it's certainly not Christian justice. It's got nothing to do with serving others. It's going to be a more worldly. At best, you're going to push in the direction of Alexander the Great notion of justice, and then you got the problem of imperialism and so forth.
So for Plato, philosophy has an end. You can achieve ultimate.
I think so. I think he thinks so. Well, otherwise they wouldn't be worthy of the title teacher. You have to master it in order to be able to teach it. Mm-hmm. Of course, they've reached an end of the journey. When you get an MA, you're a magister, you're a master at that point. I mean, I know a lot of people with master's degrees who I would not want to call teachers, but that is what the degree suggests. So at that point, you should have been able to ascertain the immaterial objects of goodness, justice, beauty, truth, and be able to convey them to students, so that they at first say, can't entirely follow it, but it sounds like it must be right, and so I'm going to pursue this myself. And it'll be like it's the allegory of the cave is like an illustration of what education is like. You've been captured by hollow and deceptive philosophies. Or in Romans 12 verse 2 he says, no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world. What's the pattern of this world? It's to look at shadows on the side of the wall, to call those just and unjust. I know the stories, I roughly know this, but you need to come out into the light. And so Paul tells us to be transformed by the renewal of our minds so that we can do what is right and please God. So I do think it can be known, yes. And so does Plato. And not only does he think it can be known, he thinks that everyone actually knows it. So this is a different dialogue, but he will teach mathematics to a slave on the basis of what he calls intuition, intelligence here. He will know things, and then he comes up with a whole theory for how people can know things that they never were exposed to. They already know it. And they've forgotten it. Their souls have been dipped into, they've been embodied, and there's a whole reincarnation thing going on there. But everybody intuitively knows what's good and true and beautiful and just. And we see it from early birth. Early childhood educators have observed that babies, before they're capable of speech still understand right and wrong and get angry about it. So babies will go red in the face when something unjust happens. And, babies have temper tantrums. You don't know why, because they can't articulate them. Sometimes it's they're hungry and you're not giving them what they want or want this. But sometimes it's they perceive an injustice and they're angered by it. It might just because mom's ignoring me, she's talking to somebody else and I want her attention. There's an element of I'm hungry, but it's also like I'm the most important one person. Why are you worrying what this person is saying? It's not right. I'm going to turn red and then blue with anger because I'm holding my breath. A sense of a moral rectitude in the world, the babies themselves. So it leans in, without ascribing to his theory, children are moral beings. They develop an awareness of consequences as they get older, as they reach an age of maturity. Which is then put into law, right? You're considered a minor up until the point where you have a sufficient moral awareness to be liable for your actions. You don't go into prison for what you might as an adult. Like kids, I don't know if you ever watch kids in a nursery. They do terrible assaults on one another. I've seen babies punch their mothers in the face all the time, and everyone goes, "Oh, that's sort of cute," whatever. Like, yeah, but he punched mom right in the nose, and on purpose. It was not an accident. And mom's sort of embarrassed because, "Oh, it's my cute little baby." So, whap. If the baby was strong enough, mom would have a broken nose. We don't hold the child accountable for it. Child just can't go through the process and can't be taught, well, you can't just hit people when they are angering you, right? So, okay. So there's a developmental phase there. So again, that gets brought into the field of education. But the main point here is that there is a thing that is good and true and just and beautiful, and the responsibility of the educator is to pull them towards that. And you might have to drag them, like the prisoner out of the cave. And they will hate you for it. They will hate you for it and resist it. Again, there's something that seems a very strong overlap with Christian teaching. They're not going to like what you have to say. You're a sinner, that you need a savior. That's not a very palatable message, per se. Anyway, I think I'm done for today. Hope that was helpful. As I say, I talked about Book 10 in as much as I needed to.